Welcome back to the panel discussion, Government's IT Modernization Imperative, sponsored by GovPlace and Dell EMC on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM. I'm your moderator, Jason Miller. My guests today are Thomas Beach, the Chief Data Strategist and Portfolio Manager of the Digital Service and Big Data at the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, George Jacobson, the Chief Information Officer at the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration, Jeff Schilling, the Chief of IT and Infrastructure Services at the National Cancer Institute, Majid Saadi, the Chief Technology Officer for GovPlace, and Bob Nicholson, the Business Development Manager for Dell Federal. So before break, we got into the cloud discussion a little bit. We talked a little bit about, I enjoyed between Bob and George, you guys were kind of talking a little bit about, it's a multiple pieces that build into what decision you make and how you do it. But I think another piece to this I'd like to explore a little bit is this idea is not just taking what you do today and moving it into the cloud. I think we've seen that with email to a certain extent. We've seen that with some collaboration software, and that's what I've been told many times is the low-hanging fruit. So how do we get, once we move out of the low-hanging fruit area, how do we get to more complexity and really look at that optimization piece? So let me start with Tom from PTO.
Thanks, it's a great question. So we're very proud that we've had delivery of our two major applications for patent examiners and trademark examiners. Our CIO and collaborations with our patents and trademarks organization have had a Herculean lift to get us to a point where we have to begin delivery of our next-gen tools. And where I see that mattering is, what was mentioned earlier again about artificial intelligence. We look at what we do as cognitive assistance, and so we would take an application like patent examination, searching, and be able to analyze it and optimize it using and leveraging machine learning technologies, only to feed that back into the system, because we're not looking to ever replace the examiner. We're always looking to improve the areas for which they have a limited time and resources to make a decision, right? So if we have to search the world for every published document, how are you possibly going to be able to do that in a limited amount of time? So we look at leveraging these tools as optimizations, but clearly they're feedback loop mechanisms for which we extract the knowledge management from our users, learn how to optimize. The delivery of next-gen tools now provides a platform for us to measure and have meaningful results come from it. So this is where the ecosystem starts to begin, and this is why we're doubling down on big data, and we're really looking at a way to say, not only do we deliver it, but we're also looking at a consistent feedback mechanism that's driven by our most important user, which is our end user, our examiners.
Give me just, if something comes to mind, an example of where this happened, where examiners are doing something you saw through the knowledge management capture and then you made a change. Anything come to mind offhand?
Yeah, so on the searching side, what we learned is that the examiners will use certain types of references more often than not. So what we're able to do is capture their use of their work product without making them go, oh, what was the reference I used or the document I used 2 months ago? I looked at a case similar to this. What it's able to do is able to capture their most sort of favored nations, if you will, of documents and references, and always sort of bubble that back up to them and say, oh, in this case, look at this application. It has more like this kind of functionality. That's what we're trying to leverage out of Solar Lucene, as well as the ability to have recommendation engines, which are built on the knowledge of the other examiners. So it's great for new examiners, but it's also great for seasoned examiners because they're now starting from the 50-yard line as opposed to starting from the first yard line on this.
I know my own search habits. I go to the same. Google's nice to tell me, oh, you visited this page 3 times since this date, and I go, oh, because I was writing a story on something. Give me another sense, Jeff or George, jump in here for a second. Either of you, are you guys doing the same thing in terms of as you're looking at the services you're doing or providing, or you're, in George's case, auditors are using? How are you ensuring you're optimizing them? Let's start with George.
Yeah, we've had a data analytics program in place probably going on 8 years now. Perhaps not as sophisticated in terms of some of the work that's being done at PTO, but nonetheless it is that force multiplier, if you please, as IT in general is, but it's that ability to have an investigator or an auditor be able to drill down into some subject matter and say, well, I want to see how this flowed out of these actions. And that's very helpful, but in terms of the AI or the cognitive recognition, which I really like that phrase, that's very good. Can I borrow that? Sure. Okay.
Not yet.
Not yet. It's not trademarked though, okay, all right. I really like that concept, and how does that change as the service provider? How does that change what I have to be able to provide to my constituency in order for them to take advantage of that. And how does that shift over time? So that comes into your optimization, and not just the forklift,
Right.
to more of the same, bigger, faster. It's not always the same.
And I imagine to a certain extent, auditors, investigators have a sort of a routine where they do the same thing every year to a certain extent. Not every.
Yeah, there are certain legislatively mandated audits that we have to do and inspections that we have to do, but the investigative area can take you almost anywhere.
Right.
And I think the danger that you have so often when you get those kinds of recommendations is you get in your own echo chamber, and then you're never really advancing the science, if you please, of the particular element that you're looking for, whether it's an investigation, whether it's a patent, or a new area of research that said, man, I never would have gone down that path had it not been for that aha moment. Yeah. Well, how do you get to that aha moment if you're doing the same thing over and over and over again? The example that I like to use, and the agents all laugh at me when I use it, but it's, we've all had the experience sometime when you walk into the kitchen and the bugs are on the floor, and as soon as you turn the lights on, well, they go into the woodwork. Well, if they know where the light is going to be, they know where to hide in the woodwork. How do you change it up so that those hiding places go away?
No wonder the auditors laugh at you when you do that.
Yeah.
Like bugs. Majid, talk a little bit about what you're hearing.
So very interesting discussion here, and I actually want to step back a little bit and talk about optimization for a second here, and maybe it would help the audience a lot if we kind of define what we mean by optimization.
Yeah, please do.
I mean, in my mind, optimization is enabling any environment to basically make more use of its existing resources, potentially. I mean, when we start talking about cloud computing, even potential resources, the resources that you can expand into, while minimizing the risk of reducing performance. So in a nutshell, we want to give you the best experience we can and save as much money and power in utilizing everything on all the resources that we've invested in, so that we don't have to buy more and more and more. So if you take that and keep that in mind, it's important to understand that you will not be able to optimize unless you have some sort of a baseline. So understanding the mission that you support, understanding the workloads that support that mission, and being able to go to a certain point in time where you realize how much these applications or these workloads are using. More importantly, and we see a lot of examples in that in the federal government, understanding the dependencies of these workloads. Without that type of data, without collecting that data for an enough period of time, any type of effort for introducing optimization becomes reactive rather than proactive. And your ability of using some of the technologies that we talked about earlier that use artificial intelligence or machine learning or algorithms to kind of help you optimize, I wouldn't say it would disappear completely, but it would diminish a little bit. So again, baselining, understanding what a workload is, how long the workload would run, and what type of resources it uses, so you can use that information to at least ensure that performance will not degrade while you're trying to optimize.
I know Bob wants to jump in before he does. Real quick, Majid. One thing about that is a lot of organizations, federal agencies, private sector organizations, doesn't matter. They don't. My experience has told me they don't do that, or they don't do it very well. Am I wrong? Tell me I'm wrong.
I mean,
no, tell me I'm wrong.
So it is true, and the problem there is most of the time it's a clash of tools or processes, or a clash of different entities within an organization trying to baseline or at least capture the data. The biggest problem that we see is typically there is a lot of data is being collected, but nothing is being done with it. So it's kind of a read-only mode. And that's a shift that needs to happen. It's kind of an evolution, like we were talking about in the break. It's an evolution that will take time. Taking that data, trying to decipher it, trying to figure out how to communicate decision making across all of these different components within an agency.
Bob, you want to jump in?
Well, yeah, and just to the point. I mean, there's a couple aspects of this, right? A couple stages, and so how we're looking at this is that, first of all, you need to modernize, right? I mean, you need to leverage the latest and greatest technology. Everything's becoming software defined, and with that attribute, then you can automate. And so kind of the point that was made earlier, where can we look to automate? That starts to build in your optimization. before you can ever transform. Right, and so the transformation is the hardest part, and so I think the common theme that you hear, and kind of something that you had mentioned as well, is how do you take some of that automation maybe and get that feedback loop. All the examples that were given here, there's an example of being able to take that information and continue to evangelize it and kind of get those cultures involved. Right, so once you start making some of those modernization efforts and then having some automation within that, sharing that information across all of your stakeholders, that's where that innovation will come to enable that transformation.
And I think by getting the people who are doing the work involved, they're going to make suggestions, which then someone like Jeff, you can go, yes, I can do that, or hold on, that becomes more complicated.
It enables decision making.
Yeah.
For us, there's really two aspects that were brought up. One is a high level, where you're optimizing the user's experience into an existing infrastructure. And the other, what Majad mentioned, is you're actually optimizing the infrastructure itself.
Right.
I mean, for us, we look a lot. We have a lot of data. It's not really around the infrastructure. It's around patients. It's around clinical trial participants. And so we have our I wouldn't call it artificial intelligence, but our a thing that we're using machines a lot to analyze data based on a rule set is called the NCI Match program. Is basically a large clinical trial that takes patients who weren't responding to standard clinical treatments for their cancer, and it does a more detailed genetic analysis. It basically personalizes their cancer, puts them into a system, runs a bunch of rules against it, and says these are the options for your specific cancer. So in the treatment world, there's FDA-approved treatments, and then there's clinical trials. And so you have to first generally go through the FDA-approved treatments and then go through the clinical trials. So this match program, basically, it's a giant machine that tells them which clinical trial they should be on. And this clinical trial specifically will give them that treatment. So those rules are constantly evolving. Infrastructure-wise, I think it wasn't necessarily really deep in terms of how it runs. It runs in the cloud. I think the thing that was really fascinating about it was how it was using these private tools. So vendors were developing sequencing machines that were generating very specific types of data. We have to work with them. We have to align them towards the FDA rules. We have to make sure everything is secure, transmitted correctly, validated. So I think there's both a baseline of optimization that you could do for your infrastructure as well as the next level. And I think that next level is important because it allows your users, the people who really authorize your budget, to understand how powerful automation is. Instead of just saying, can I just get a computer to do this? It's like, well, that's a very difficult thing to do sometimes because what you're asking us to do is very difficult.
It's an interesting point about the two different types of optimizations. Majid, talk a little bit about, are you seeing agencies more on the user experience optimization or more on the infrastructure optimization, or both?
Definitely both, and it's really driven by the type of entity that's starting the optimization initiative. So we see a lot of application development groups or the people that are more concerned about the top layer of the stack, concerned with the user experience or the performance of the application itself. And we see a lot of the infrastructure teams basically concerned with optimizing the utilization of the infrastructure. We're starting to see some examples where both are basically collaborating together. And it's mainly because for the longest time, the two teams would point the finger at each other and say, it's not my problem, it's yours, it's not the performance of my code is good,
Perfect.
It's your infrastructure, or the other way around, infrastructure is fine, everything is working, and it's the code that's breaking everything. So tooling and automation right now enables you to basically take a look at the entire picture end to end and really focus on the user experience. Why is the user experiencing some performance degradation? And allowing those teams to basically share these types of tools, or at least the data coming out of these tools, makes this problem kind of disappear. I've seen environments where actually developers fall in love with this idea because they don't have to fight among each other or with the infrastructure team and convince them that their code is right. It's so easy to basically pinpoint the problem and say, okay, I'll take care of fixing the code, or hey, we need just a little bit more bandwidth on this piece. There's another example that I would mention, and it's actually maybe something that Jeff can talk about. I had an experience of actually getting a little bit of information about the genomics work that NCI was working on, and the idea of basically taking a data common of the genomics or the data information and placing it in the cloud or placing it in a common area where all users can access it is an amazing one, and enables optimization of user experience across multiple workloads. I don't know if you can share a little bit more about it.
I'm going to make you hold on for a sec because we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll jump back into that. You teed it up perfectly for me. Thank you.
No problem.
You're listening to the panel discussion, Government's IT Modernization Imperative, sponsored by GovPlace and Dell EMC on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM.